EverQuest. It was a household name back in the early 2000s. It was basically one of the first big mainstream MMORPGs to hit the mainstream gaming audience at the time. So after the success EverQuest had in the early 2000s, it was only natural for them to continue that success with a sequel, which is obviously a bit different nowadays, but you gotta remember, MMORPGs back then were completely new. EverQuest II was the next big step for EverQuest, released all the way back in 2004, 5 years after the original EverQuest. Unfortunately, it released on the eclipse of World of Warcraft, which completely dethroned EverQuest and EverQuest II in terms of popularity. EQ2 faced a ton of unfortunate setbacks during its launch window, but now it's nearly 20 years later. The game, to many people's surprise, is still playable to this day, even getting expansions on a regular basis, with a new one right around the corner. I missed out on the EverQuest craze as a kid, but I always wanted to jump in and find out what I was missing. So I downloaded EverQuest II, created an account, and boy, do I have a lot to talk about. So let's get into it.
EverQuest II, where adventure comes alive.
The story of EverQuest II and EverQuest in general is so incredibly vast that it could probably span a 30-minute long video in itself. So I'm going to just give a quick summary of EverQuest II overarching lore. Essentially, EverQuest II is not actually a direct sequel to the original EverQuest. Instead, the game is set in a parallel universe, diverging from a storyline that was set up in the Planes of Power expansion from the original EverQuest. Basically, it pulls a Legend of Zelda, where timeline splits into its own separate universe, coinciding with the original EverQuest. Because of that, you will see many landmarks and even characters from the original EverQuest, which is a neat throwback if you played the original. Story bits aside, once you've created an account and logged in, you'll be greeted with quite a number of options that can be a bit confusing. There is a number of servers to choose from to play in: traditional, progression, events, free trade, and lore and legend. EverQuest II is a free-to-play game, but most server types are restricted unless you pay the subscription fee. Traditional servers are self-explanatory. They have no special rules and essentially have all content expansions available to play. Progression servers are servers that restrict content and release them slowly over time. Think how World of Warcraft Classic plays, as these servers essentially take the game back to how it played at launch and then slowly release content expansions over time. The event tab leads to the one major PvP server available. Not sure why it's called events instead of PvP, but alas, it's called event. The free trade server allows you to basically trade everything to other players, even items that would normally not be tradable. Lastly, the lore and legend server allows you to play the game without worrying about progression. Instead, the game scales your character's power to the content you play, so everything is challenging but not too challenging. This allows you to play the game in any way you want to, well, experience the game's lore and storyline. With so many options, one would think all of these would suit any playstyle, and technically it does on paper. The problem is population. Every single server except for the newest time lock server all have low population, unfortunately. So while there is a ton of ways to play EverQuest II, the best place to actually have interaction is going to be limited to one server, at least until the newest expansion comes out. Once you've chosen your server type, you then choose your class and race. There is a healthy number of class choices in EQ2, all broken down into 4 archetypes: fighter, priest, mage, and scout. Fighters have the choices of being guardians, berserkers, monks, bruisers, paladins, and shadow knights. The priest classes are templars, inquisitors, wardens, channelers, furies, mystics, and defilers. Mages have the choices of wizards, warlocks, illusionists, coercers, conjurers, and necromancers. Lastly, scouts can be swashbucklers, brigands, troubadours, beastlords, dirges, rangers, and assassins. Race choices are broken down into alignments: good, neutral, and evil. These are essentially the factions of EverQuest II. Good and evil aligned characters will be able to visit certain cities and have access to their own respective faction quest lines. Neutral characters can choose their alignment based on their choices, and technically, every character can be whatever alignment they want, because each character can actually betray their alignment through a series of quests if they choose to do so, which is actually a pretty cool feature. All the normal fantasy races are here and then some, totaling 22 different race choices to play as.
I didn't know you had elves working here.
Boy, you're hilarious, my friend.
Each race also has slightly different stats and perks, but it honestly doesn't make a difference in the grand scheme of things at endgame, so make any choice you like to play and you'll be fine. Once you've made the class and race choices, the character creator is pretty standard for a near 20-year-old game. You can choose between being a man or a woman, hairstyles, facial sliders, body sliders, skin tone, accessories, etc. Once you get into the game, each class plays similar within their archetype, such as warriors having some ability to tank, priests being healers, with mages and scouts being DPS. All classes do have their own unique play styles though, so if you're curious on how a class plays at high levels, it's actually not a bad idea to try previewing a level 100 character, something the game allows you to do by selecting Create Heroic Character. Heroic characters can only be created on a server that allows you to boost characters on, and a preview character is restricted unless you spend the money to unlock the full play. So that should pretty much be everything in terms of options for character creation, so let's finally get to actual gameplay.
That's what we've been waiting for! It's what we wanted all along!
Once you are in game with whatever options you choose, you are greeted with a small tutorial, either with the beginning quest line or prompts that will help teach you the game. From here, gameplay is pretty standard. Questing, fighting enemies, and crafting and collecting resources is the basic features of EQ2, pretty much like every other MMORPG. Questing is the basic fare, with most quests having you collecting a specific item or killing a certain monster. Some quests are a bit more vague though, like having to visit a specific spot on the map or interact with a tiny item somewhere. Those quests often require some sort of online guide to complete, since without some sort of guide, those quests have very little information on how to complete them usually. Combat in EQ2 is the standard tab target combat. Simply select an enemy and start attacking them using your spells and abilities. Combat is pretty slow in the beginning, admittedly, since you don't have many skills to rotate, but once you get into the mid-20s or so, combat does start to flesh out with more depth, especially with the game's heroic opportunity system. It's not that extensive, admittedly, but essentially you can start a combo using a specific spell, then can chain off of other spells that you or your party use to get in extra damage, buffs, or extra effects when fighting enemies. It's similar to the chain system from Final Fantasy XI, so if you are familiar with that, then opportunities here will be easy to grasp. Finally, crafting is also a major component in EverQuest II. Starting out, you will begin as a universal crafter called an artisan, being able to craft pretty much everything under the sun: armor, weapons, ammo, potions, augments, etc. Once you reach crafting level 10, which is pretty easy, you then choose a specialization that focuses on specific components. Once you reach level 20, you then choose your final specialization that becomes your crafting class. The crafting classes are carpenter, provisioner, woodworker, weaponsmith, armorer, tailor, alchemist, jeweler, and sage. There are additional crafting skills like tinkering, adorning, and transmutation, but depending on the server you play, those won't be available. Either way you look at it though, crafting is done at specific crafting benches and actually remind me of Final Fantasy XIV's crafting system, where you play a small minigame that influences if you successfully craft or not. I like this system to an extent, as it keeps crafting a bit more engaging, but once you craft more than a few items, it becomes more tedious than interactive, unfortunately. Character progression ties to your main level, your crafting level, and then obviously your equipment. Depending on your server, you also get alternate advancement options, which are similar to talent trees in other games. The level cap varies from server to server, but equipment has a universal streamlining to it, which admittedly I don't inherently like. So genuinely in MMORPGs, things like talent trees open up classes to have a bit of customization to it, right? Same with race choices, since they typically have varying stats or racial passive abilities. Equipment is usually also customizable to a small extent. EverQuest II's equipment opts to have a more mainstream-friendly approach though. Practically all equipment until endgame have little to no variation because stats are streamlined. Each piece of equipment raises all of your stat points by a given amount, which means if you find two rings of a similar level, neither one will have different stats in most cases, they'll genuinely be the same. Eventually, you can add augments to equipment depending on your server, but things are still largely streamlined. I can understand what the developers were going for in terms of making it easier for players to equip the absolute best items for your class, but taking away choices makes them for less enjoyment in my opinion. I can at least admit it does get your character outfitted generally faster for content. The last bit of progression is spell upgrading. Each spell has a rank that can be upgraded to a specific max rank. Most spells can be upgraded via crafters to make books or recipes that will upgrade the spell, but some spells can only be upgraded if you are lucky enough to get the spell drop in dungeons. Spells can also be upgraded by researching them beginning at level 20. Researching takes real-life time to upgrade the spells. In some cases, depending on your level, some spells can take days to upgrade. Yes, days. Or you can spend real-life money to upgrade them immediately with cash shop currency. We'll talk about the cash shop in a bit. Now, dungeons are debatably the main meat and potatoes of EverQuest II's content, being some of the best places to grind for XP and endgame gear. Around level 15 to 20, you'll gain access to some of the game's first group-based dungeons. Here you will find elite mobs that give more XP and drop better items, which makes sense. For solo players, there are solo-based dungeons as well that you can unlock through questing, so there is quite a bit of solo dungeoneering to experience if that is what you are into. Raids will also be the game's ultimate challenge, with endgame raid dungeons housing up to 24 players to tackle them. World bosses also exist in EverQuest II, with the most difficult world bosses also requiring raid groups to take them out. In general, EverQuest II has content for most player types: solo, small group, and large groups. I wish I could say the same for PvP, which as far as I've been able to find, is mostly relegated to the incredibly barren PvP server. If other PvP options exist, I wasn't able to find it in-game or even online, which is such a weird thing to say. Player-owned housing is in the game for those who like that system as well, and honestly, the amount of detail you can put into a creation is astounding. I mean, look at this. This is crazy. A dungeon maker system also exists, but it seemed so incredibly forgotten, which is a shame considering I've always enjoyed player-made content. Speaking of players, let's talk about how players support the game via EverQuest II membership or the cash shop. EverQuest II is a free-to-play game for the most part. As a free player, you have access to only the traditional servers. Servers like the PvP and time lock servers are members only. The subscription is your standard $15 a month, and since it's Daybreak, paying for membership actually grants you membership to all of their games, including EverQuest I. The cash shop in EverQuest II is also a bit of a confusing mess, since once again, it all depends on what server you're playing on. From a traditional server, you can buy things like level boosters and experience potions, as well as other items that give a slight advantage, like larger inventory sizes. On more restricted servers, you can only buy cosmetic items, as most of the items in the cash shop are disabled on those servers. There is also a player-made items section in the cash shop that lists cosmetics that players have made for sale, another neat feature. The cash shop prices on a lot of these items though are just so incredibly expensive, so really the only thing that's worth it is the subscription to play on any server. Otherwise, skip the cash shop entirely. One last item you can purchase in the cash shop is Chronos, which is EverQuest II's version of WoW tokens. Chronos cost real money but can be traded to other players, so you can basically just buy money in-game by buying Chronos, even in the restricted servers. If you don't want to spend money on membership though, you can at least potentially earn membership by getting Chronos, so at least that's an option. And the game has to make money somehow, so while I don't like all the items or pricing in the cash shop, I can see why it exists. Realistically though, the game as a whole all feels like a relic of its time. Great ideas, set pieces, and even genre-defining staples, all created in this online world of EverQuest. The problem? EverQuest II itself, and even to an extent the name EverQuest, has been forgotten largely to the evolution of the MMORPG genre that started with World of Warcraft. It all feels like one big theme park with a lot of cool rides and attractions, but it's just empty. That's unfortunately the best way to describe EverQuest II, a fun, empty theme park that a lot of people will probably never experience. Let's get to my closing thoughts. EverQuest II has a lot of ways to experience the game, whether it be traditionally on a normal server or on one of its special rule servers. The game at least gives those options for different ways to experience it. EverQuest II has quite a lot of different class and race combinations that allow you to create a relatively unique character within the community. For the most part, you luckily also don't have to worry about min-maxing your character, so pick whatever race looks good to you and jump in. If you like player-created content like player-owned housing or dungeon creation, this game has it. There's a ton of options when it comes to these systems, so depending on how much time you spend in them, you can create some insane projects. The game has nearly 20 years worth of content to go out and discover, with more content on the way. Lastly, the game has an incredibly small but friendly community that welcomes new players with open arms. Even though the game offers quite a few options and servers for ways to play, many of its servers are just straight up void of players. Don't be surprised to find many of the servers with as little as only 10 people or so online, unfortunately, which is probably a side effect of having so many different servers trying to accommodate different players rather than housing all players under one server. Even though the game has come a long way since its launch, there is still issues in some cases with the game chugging within its engine. I've been told it's nowhere near as bad as it used to be, but for how old this game is, it should run like butter on practically any modern PC at this point. The cash shop in EQ2 is pretty bad in my opinion. Many items are incredibly expensive or can give players with money a big advantage over players who don't spend money. Lastly, the game's default UI and overall feel is pretty clunky. If you plan to dive deep into EQ2, expect to mod the UI and have a game guide up at all times to help you quest or teach game mechanics. It's sad to see how far the EverQuest brand has fallen. As I was playing EverQuest II, I was getting sparks of theme park MMORPGs. Games like World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy XIV, Final Fantasy XI, Rift, The Secret World. Man, there's just too many to name. EverQuest II on its launch just made entirely too many fumbles to the point of where it will just never recover at this point. In the MMORPG market, first impressions are everything. It takes an absolute miracle for a game to win back an audience once it's lost. I could imagine a world where EverQuest kept its popularity and is still one of the biggest MMORPGs on the market, but sadly, I don't see anything happening like that soon, short of a brand new game that will bring EverQuest back into the spotlight. But hey, anything is possible, right? But that's all for this video. Do you play EverQuest II? Let me know down below in the comments section. Like the video to help us level into the algorithm, subscribe to the channel to support my content, links to all my social media in the description, and I will see you in the next video.